In this last presentation for this unit, we're going to be talking about a variety of topics. We're going to be talking about communication styles, language universals, language learning, and interpretation and translation. We're going to start talking about what languages have in common, and we're going to hear from Steven Pinker on that topic.
And what do all languages have in common? What's the essence that they have in common?
I would say two things. One is the ability to refer to concepts by an arbitrary pairing of a sound and a meaning. So we use the word duck to refer to the things that go quack.
Yeah.
It could have been chicken, but it just happens to be duck. It
Right.
could have been something else in another language. And we memorize tens of thousands of these words, and that is true in every language. There are vocabulary in the tens of thousands. Second, words get combined into phrases and sentences according to grammatical rules that manipulate things like nouns and verbs.
According to Pinker, the first characteristic that all languages have in common is that they have a way of pairing a sound with a meaning. So that's the use of symbols to point to specific objects. And they have nouns and verbs that are used to put together sentences. Let's hear some more about that topic, in this case from Suzette Elgin, talking more about what languages have in common.
All human languages have something that is sort of nouny and something that is sort of verby. They all do. All human languages have a way to make things negative.
No way, Jose.
No way, Jose.
All human languages have a way to ask a question.
If I'm asking a question, I'll lower my eyebrows. Where are you from? What's your name? Who is that person?
All human languages have a way to indicate a difference between just one and more than one.
In the Eskimo languages, you have not only the singular, for example, ugaik, one rabbit, ugaik, two rabbits, ugait, three or more rabbits.
And so it goes. Each language has a list of obligatory distinctions. Male, female, definite, indefinite, singular, plural, past, present. This is the stock of categories that the human mind uses to schematize experience.
And Chomsky asked the question, why is this? Why are languages so similar? Why are they all cut from the same mold? And his answer was,
there are fixed invariant principles, fixed invariant structural principles, which are simply part of the human biological endowment and that determine what counts as a human language.
it's because the human brain is pre-wired to accept only certain kinds of languages, and that the grammatical properties of the languages of the world have those properties that they do because the human mind has those properties.
Those things which are true of all languages are the candidates for what the child comes into the world knowing about the nature of the language to which he is being exposed.
The child might very well have a plan for what is a possible rule in a human language. So languages can have verbs then objects or objects then verbs, but those are two possibilities that every language has one or the other of. And the child can simply worry about which of those two versions his language has. What he's got to pick up are the particular versions of the rules that everyone else in the community is using.
So we already had from Steven Pinker these two characteristics. And what we hear now from that recent clip is that these are some additional characteristics that languages share: a way of expressing negative, a way to ask questions, a way to count, and most have verbs and subjects, verbs and objects of those verbs. In the textbook you have some other characteristics as well. One of those, according to the text, is that all human speech is transmitted via a vocal auditory channel. Well, it's not the case if you take into account sign language, which I think we need to do. According to Chomsky, why do we have these common characteristics across languages? It's because they are hardwired into our DNA. It's part of our biology. We're born with with these characteristics, and language therefore follows our biology. The particular language that we learn from the input that we hear as a child. We're going to talk in this chapter also about communication styles. And we've talked about these common structural elements in languages across the world. But in practice, how language is used varies quite a bit, and it varies across cultures, but it also varies obviously within cultures. One of those distinctions is how language tends to be used in high context versus low context cultures. And this is a topic we've talked about before, namely that in high context cultures there's a lot more going on to transmit meaning than just language, the context, the status of the individuals involved, the context in which they're meeting and talking, the use of nonverbal communication. Those are all important factors in high context cultures in terms of transmitting meaning. Whereas in low context cultures, such as the United States, there's more emphasis on the actual language being spoken and less on external factors. We also have what are called speech codes that differ across cultures. And these, to a certain extent, are related to what we're just talking about, namely the kind of culture that the individual comes from. So what's called restricted code is associated normally with collectivistic and high context cultures. And what we mean by restricted code is that not that there's a limited number of words, vocabulary in that language, but rather that there's, in the context in which the conversation takes place, there are a limited number of options in terms of the kind of language that's going to be used. And that's distinct from what's called elaborated code, where the speakers can choose from a great variety of options, and that's more associated with individualistic low context cultures such as the United States. So which code is used depends on the culture, but it can be also the context in which communication takes place. So if we look at an example in the United States, if you're talking with friends, got together at a restaurant or are together in a apartment, you're going to not have any or very few restrictions on the kind of conversations that you're going to have. You're going to be using elaborated code. However, think about other contexts. For example, if you're in church, there's a certain ritual attached to that, which means that there's certain language attached to that context. The same is true in other environments, in particular environments, say in a prison, for example. There you have very restricted code as well. So it's a cultural thing, but it's also a contextual thing in terms of speech codes, use of speech codes. We're going to talk about verbal interaction styles. What we mean here is the way in which language is used through the tone of voice and through the kind of language that's used. And we're going to talk about these different modes of interaction, starting with direct versus indirect. And this is something that we've referenced before. This is also associated with cultural differences. And this is the distinction between saying directly and unambiguously what's on your mind, which is the direct style, typical of the United States and England, Germany, Israel, versus the indirect style, which is more typical of Asian countries, where you don't necessarily say what's on your mind. that that you hint around, that you tend to use ambiguous responses. One of the famous examples is the use in Japan of the word for yes, which in Japanese is hai. But hai can mean yes, but it can also mean I hear you. It can also mean I'm thinking about it. It can mean a variety of things. It's not necessarily the same as yes, or in Germany if somebody says ja. Those are pretty unambiguous, whereas hai just indicates that that the person has heard what you're saying. So what we can say about direct style is that the statements that are made directly reveal the speaker's intention, whereas the indirect style, the verbal statements camouflage the speaker's actual intentions. Another way we can talk about communication styles is the quantity or volume of language being used. And here we can distinguish an elaborate communication style, which uses extensive and embellished language, metaphorical language, typical of Middle Eastern, Arab, African American cultures, or the so-called exacting communication styles. I'm not sure if the book's reference to the television show Dragnet in the 1960s means anything to you, but basically that's the tagline of that show was just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And so this is just conveying what's necessary is the idea behind the exacting communication style. And succinct is what's associated with, for example, Asian cultures or Native American cultures, where a lot is expressed through nonverbal means, and particularly through the use of silence. It uses restricted code, so there are rituals often involved. One of those rituals would be, for example, in Japan, the bowing, the significance of that, and the extensive use of silence in Native American culture. Another way to approach communication styles is to compare a personal style to a contextual style. Personal styles, what would be associated with individualistic cultures, where the emphasis is on symmetry, that is to say on equality of the speakers, and where the tone of the conversation is very informal. Whereas in the contextual style, you have an emphasis on status, on the hierarchy of individuals involved, so that there's certain formality to the conversation. Power distance is large. And so in contextual kind of communication style, you would use, for example, titles or honorifics that are common in many Asian cultures, for example. You would use the formal mode of communication. And another way to talk about communication styles is to differentiate an instrumental speaking style from an effective. Instrumental, the idea is you're using language as an instrument to get something accomplished. It's associated more with men than with women. Whereas the effective style is you're taking into consideration not just what it is that you want, but how the other person is receiving your communication. And so there's a reference there to the politeness formulas in Japan, and that's supposed to be haiku, not hailu, which is typical of kind of the Japanese effective communication style. We're going to move on to language learning and talk about language learning in the context of intercultural communication. Obviously a very important topic. It's not just that learning a foreign language teaches you about the culture, it really puts you inside of the culture. And one of the other benefits of the process of language learning is that it gives you some appreciation in encountering people whose first language is not English. And it provides an important link between the verbal code and the ability to use other means to communicate. So if you're not able to come up with what you wanted to say in a second language, you need to find other ways to do that. Let's talk a little bit about language learning methods and how they've evolved. First of all, there's a distinction between how a first language, a native language, is learned in a second language. There's a whole field of what's called second language acquisition, which deals with that topic. And in that area of second language acquisition and language pedagogy, there have been a number of developments over the years in terms of approaches to language learning. When I was taking language in school, in high school and in college, the predominant teaching method was called grammar translation. And I remember in our fourth semester in German class in college, for example, that what we did in class was we had a libretto, the text of an opera, and we went around and translated it into English. We never did any conversation in German at all in that class. That was in reaction to that, a method was developed in the 70s and 80s called the audiolingual approach, which went the opposite direction, namely was only oral, and went really too far in that direction and relied too much on memorizing dialogues. The method that's used predominantly today in language learning is called the communicative method, and it's based on language competency, language proficiency, being able to actually do something with the language. And in that sense, it's task-based. That is to say, you should be able to accomplish tasks in that language. For example, you should be able to order a drink from the bar, or should be able to buy a train ticket in the target culture, things like that. There are a lot of ways to learn languages. Obviously, you can take a class. Probably the most effective way to learn a language, however, is not to take a course, but to go live in the culture in which where that language is spoken. You can do self-study as well. There are lots of tools for that. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. If you're working on learning a second language, there are a number of issues that arise in terms of difficulty. It depends on your native language and how similar your native language may be to your target language. So, for example, if you're German and learning a Scandinavian language, it's not much of a leap there. Same is true if you're French and learning Italian. On the other hand, if you speak a European language and try to learn Japanese or Chinese, that's a big jump. Also, obviously, depends on individual ability. Some people are very good at mimicking sounds, for example, or other people are very good at the analytical skill of analyzing how sentences are put together and feel comfortable with grammar. I'd say that's kind of a minority, but there are folks like that. And probably a underestimated factor in the ability to learn languages is motivation. If you're really motivated, you're gonna work hard at it, and you're gonna learn the language. What are some issues that arise? Well, one of those is learning the alphabet. This can be a fairly minor thing. For example, if you're learning Russian, you have to learn the Cyrillic alphabet. It's not really very difficult. You can learn that in the first week of class. On the other hand, if you're learning Chinese, you have to learn Chinese characters. That is something altogether different and much more difficult. In terms of vocabulary, there too, if the language you're learning is similar to your own language, that's a great help. So if you're learning German as a native speaker of English, there are lots of cognates, lots of words that look the same. But at the same time, there are idiomatic expressions, figurative uses of language that usually don't transfer from one language to another. In terms of pronunciation, there too, it depends on your native language. There are languages that are very difficult because they have sounds that are quite possibly not in your own language. So the clicks, for example, the Xhosa language is an example of that, African language. Tones can be very difficult for English speakers, tone-based languages. Thai, for example, has 5 tones. Cantonese has 7 tones. Well, if you don't grow up with those tones, it's hard to, first of all, recognize the tones, and second, to reproduce the distinctions among those tones. Grammar is something I would say that's much easier to learn later in life. It's an analytical skill. Languages differ in terms of complexity of grammar. Chinese, for example, is very simple in terms of grammar. No verbs are conjugated. There are no differences. There are no cases, so there are no case endings on anything. There are other difficulties with Chinese, but certainly not grammar. And there's, of course, speaking fluency, which you can only get with practice. That's not something that you can learn theoretically or from a book. Well, how difficult is it to learn a language? Well, some people say, well, I can't, certain languages sound like they're awfully fast, but that's probably because spoken in a very fast way, but that's probably because they're unfamiliar to you. There have been studies that have dealt with the amount of information conveyed per syllable, and so there are dense languages and less dense languages. And the same is true in terms of language difficulty. There are various lists, and I've put a link up in Blackboard to that if you're interested to see where languages rank in difficulty. There are folks out there who learn multiple languages, who have that really as a hobby. And I put up a clip of one of those polyglots just to give you an idea of what it might be like to learn multiple languages. And I really encourage you to watch this video. It's kind of an amazing thing, his daily routine in terms of the number of languages that he learns and how he tries to keep up the knowledge of a language. That's the other difficulty with language learning, that if you spend the time and effort learning a language, you want to keep that ability, and so that you have to work on that as well. How old can you be to start learning a language? Well, you can do it at any age, and there have been studies recently that show that learning a language late in life is actually something that's very beneficial to your brain. It can help ward off Alzheimer's. But to learn to speak without an accent, you almost always have to start at an early age. If you start as an adolescent or in college, it's very difficult to, first of all, get the speaking fluency down, but second, to speak with a native or near-native accent. With some languages, there's some speculation that there's a different way to learn the language depending on what that language is. So, for example, there's one method of learning Japanese that calls on learning the characters first before you learn any speaking at all, to learn the characters, the kanji characters. These are the Chinese-related characters in Japanese. There are actually 3 different sets of characters, but the extensive character set is the one that's derived from Chinese, and that is very difficult to learn because it's fairly abstract. How much does grammar matter when you're learning a language? Well, kind of depends on the language. If you're learning Russian, Russian is a very heavily inflected language, and to convey what it is you want to say, you have to get those endings right, because if you don't, then the sentence won't make sense. And there are other languages where that's not so important. There's overlap in language learning in the sense that if you learn one language, it's much easier to learn the second language because you know how language works and how language learning works. It's also the case that skills, this is something that's been learned in research in second language acquisition in recent years, that language skills transfer. That is to say, learning, doing a lot of reading, for example, improves your speaking. Well, why is that? Well, one of the reasons is it exposes you to a lot of vocabulary. Building up your vocabulary is important in listening comprehension, but also obviously in speaking and other skills as well. And there are ways these days to measure language proficiency. There's a European framework for languages. There's the ACTFL standards, that's the American Council on Teaching Foreign Languages, and there are standardized exams that are associated with those organizations. We're going to talk very briefly about interpretation and translation. Those are important concepts in our globalized world today, and it's becoming more and more important in a variety of fields. There's a distinction between written translation and spoken translations. So the term interpretation actually it refers to when a text is, or a message is translated orally from one language to another, whereas translation refers to the written process. And we have different modes of interpreting. And what I think a lot of people associate with interpretation is the simultaneous mode, which is what's used, for example, in the United Nations, where somebody is speaking and there's an interpreter who's going along at the same time and interpreting in real time. But there's also much more common, actually, is consecutive mode interpretation, where a speaker will speak a few sentences and then the interpreter will come in and put that into the target language. Just a few things about technology for language use today. Has progressed amazingly in the last 10 years. An example of that is Google Translate. It uses parallel corpuses, and a corpus is simply a collection of texts, and it varies in terms of how good it is, the Google Translate. Some languages where there's a very rich dual corpus, parallel corpus, the effectiveness of Google Translate is quite high. Other languages is not so efficient. There's a lot of software available. This is something we're going to be looking at, in fact, in the next unit. We'll be trying out some of this language learning software. And the last issue that we're going to be talking about in this unit is English, the role of English. And that's discussed to a certain extent in Chapter 7 in terms of American English. I want to just say a few things about English in general. English obviously has become the lingua franca of today's world, and it's widely dispersed. There are an awful lot of second language English learners. English is the predominant language on the internet, although not as much as it used to be. And so English is all over the world. There's a lot of reference to something called World English, which is a way of using English so that it doesn't, that you can be widely understood, that you don't use specific Americanisms or expressions that are unique to a particular brand of English, Australian English or Scottish English, for example, and that you try to speak with as neutral an accent as possible. And English is obviously, to go back to that, English is the official language of a number of countries, but it's the unofficial language of exchange in many more countries than that. I've put in you see the picture of the young woman there. I put in a video of her that was kind of a very popular YouTube video. She has the ability to speak in a variety of accents in English, and so if you haven't seen that video, take a look at that. It's really interesting how well she does that. And the other thing to me that illustrates is how many different varieties of English there are out there. I'm not going to delve into this topic because I think it's covered fairly well in the textbook, namely Varieties of American English. And also I've put up in the media folder for Chapter 7 some excerpts from the television series that's widely used in the textbook to talk about these different varieties of American English. So do take a look at those videos.